Thank you, Nico, very much indeed. Conor, would you like to give some initial reactions to that? And then we'll ask for the lights to go up and we'll have the questions and answers.
I think Kevin expressed pleasure at the organised mind of lawyers, just as you started, and observed that he said there would be 2 parts and each would have 3, and each had 3 and there were 2 parts. So I'm always knocked out by such organisation. I'll only make 1 point, just 1 point, because there's so much there that stands really on its own. But I've never, ever been accused of being British parochialism before, ever. And let me plug my next book. It's coming out in the spring with Oxford University Press. It's called On Fantasy Island. And it's a description of Britain's deluded post-colonial fascination with itself manifest in such idiotic interventions as attacks on the European Court of Human Rights. And I gave this as a public lecture in LSE last year. I'm very happy. And it became a kind of little bit of Samstat literature at Strasbourg, because poor old Strasbourg judges can't fight back. But they were very glad to have an internationalist Irishman fighting back for them. So I defend myself on that, and the others are very sharp.
How things turn out each evening, I thought I was going to be safe. I'm sat between a Greek and an Irishman. I didn't realize this was going to be another evening of British guilt. Tell us, Bandam. We now have the opportunity for you to make comments and ask questions. I think there are colleagues with microphones, so perhaps if, oh, that's better, we can see you now. If perhaps you could indicate if you would like to give a question and just simply say who you are and make your brief comments or question, please. Ah, yes, sorry, yes, here, thank you. Sorry,
thank you, thank you. Thank you to both friends and colleagues. And I was rather embarrassed that Nikos mentioned my twice, my perhaps unlucky involvement with politics. However, I was going to break some news here. When the crisis struck, and of course Ireland became a part of PIGS, it was all the other southern European states and Ireland, we discussed a number of drunken evenings, typical Greco-Irish relationship, the possibility of Conor standing for the presidency of Ireland. And I offered to be his campaign manager. I had lived in Ireland for a few years. I mean, I love Ireland and so on. Eventually, unfortunately, he decided not to do it, although I hope that one day we will meet in political salons as well. And of course, you, my friend Nikos, were the candidate for the presidency of Greece, for Potami. So there you are. We're all involved in this kind of business. As far as I'm concerned, I would only say that I'm trying a certain impossible mission. As a number of people, including my good friend Thalia Dragona, told me, you cannot be an academic if you are a politician. Now, for the last 3 months, I'm commuting to London every week to teach my class. I supervise my students, and I'm trying the impossible thing of being part-time academic and part-time politician. But a final point about the wonderful talk of Conor, and you realized the amazing emotional and rhetorical angst and anger and commitment that an Irishman like Conor has, who I hope one day to be the president of Ireland did. And he made a very important point, that we keep adding new rights in new areas and new disciplines and expanding the scope of rights. But this is one of the periods in our history that the idea of humanity and the values, the universal values of humanity in Europe are being denied to huge numbers of people, including the 850,000 refugees who ended up in Greece in this year alone. So we do have human rights, but there is no humanity. And what this event and the series of events has proved, both in relation to Greece and in relation to other areas who receive refugees, is a point that Hannah Arendt made in 1951 in her wonderful origins of totalitarianism. She was talking about the stateless people in the interwar periods. You may have human rights, but if you don't have political and legal protection, you count for nothing. You are just bare life. And this is where I totally side with Conor. We keep talking about rights and legal rights and human rights and Strasbourg, but for a large part of humanity, there's absolutely no protection.
Okay, thank you. Other comments? Other comments, other questions, please. Can we take the question down here, please? Yes, indeed.
Hello, my name is Marilena Simiti. My question relates to power. In your talk, there's an implicit assumption that power is separate, decoupled from society. So power, the European institutions, lead and depose these viruses, while society have a different identity. So my question is whether these viruses are also very present in societies, and Islamophobia is a very representative example. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Another comment, another question before we ask Conor to respond. Could you take the gentleman just behind you, please?
Hello, my name is Alexandros Karidis. Touching on the title, I think there is a slight difference between what we call Kratos Δικαίου, which is the German Rechtsstaat, excuse me for my bad German accent, and what British calls rule of law. So I would like an answer on whether the slight difference between the two notions changes the way we see democracy in Europe, and whether, in the end, rule of law is a quintessential element of democracy, or democracy could exist in a future world without a rule of law element. Second, everybody agrees that one of the core features of the rule of law is predictability. So in order to touch the political reality of Greece as well, I think that when we have a situation that the tax legislation changes every 2 months, and nobody can really design his life on a predictable way, whether these poisons a threat towards the rule of law, and what can we do for that in the future?
Thank you. I wondered, Conor, if I could just add to the final points before inviting you to respond. It's implicit in several comments which we've had about the changes to a market economy, changes within globalization. But to what extent can we constitutionalize economic rights in a market economy? To what extent can we protect rights which are essentially economic as a market changes?
Thank you, Kevin, very much. I'll just react to each of the remarks, I think, and then I'm sure you might want to come in as well. But I would take them in the order they came. Costas, whom I'm sure you all know, actually. He didn't say who he was, because I think we all know you're Costas, so it's my good friend Costas. And yeah, I'd forgotten that conversation. I think there may have been a bottle of Retsina or something involved. I can't remember. But it was good fun. And there's a lot of solidarity between the Irish and the Greeks. And Costas has been an important part of that. What Costas and I tried to do in 2 books, we've had this fantastic working relationship in the last few years. And we've edited 2 books. And we've tried to win back the language of human rights and give it some of its original zeal and soul, because we have this situation, we're both committed to it, but we recognize how it's appropriated and how it's infected and how it is damaged by power. Madeleine, more on that in a minute. And we want to have some sense of the importance of it still for people who need to be able to impart a sense of obligation, a sense of right in their standing up to people. And I think that's still valuable, because Hannah Arendt was spot on then, and human rights now risks being turned into this accessory for the already affluent, which is what Costas was saying at the end. However, hypocrisy is sometimes a good thing, you know, because the society is ostensibly committed to human rights. It does create gaps that we can manage and manipulate. So it gives us opportunities, political, legal opportunities. Madeli's point about power. I suppose if I'd been properly educated, I might be a Marxist, but I never studied Marx. So, but I do think an awful lot of what we think about today is traced back to money, and money then informs the way we view things and is therefore capable of infecting our democratic culture and our legal culture. Money allows people who resist a ban on hunting with dogs in the United Kingdom to fight not one but two huge House of Lords cases to try and stop it on human rights grounds. Money is what has turned the American process into the joke that I remarked upon in my lecture. So I think power doesn't sit above society. Power works through society and institutions in society. And what struck me is just how bizarre this desire of extraordinarily well-off people is to have money, and to have more and more of it. I read a biography of Rockefeller who threw money in the air because it gave him physical pleasure. And we have yet again one of these people with $46 billion, the chap who founded Facebook, who's going to give it all away, but give it all away on his basis, you know, and control it in his way. Why not just have tax, you know? Alexander, there is a lecture on the rule of law and legality, which you may have had to listen to once. Democracy and legality. I think in a properly functioning democratic system, the judges should be restricted to the interpretation of statutes and the interpretation of codes. And so I've got quite a narrow approach to legality. The Anglo-Saxon approach of rule of law suggests that the judges have an additional capacity to evaluate for moral worth. And I'm a little suspicious of that, and a bit anxious in the British, to be provincial, system of a very class-based judiciary with a very conservative set of instincts. Empowering them to adjudicate on the quality of law leaves me a bit anxious. The Human Rights Act in Britain, which the Conservatives want to repeal, has got a very nice compromise. You're absolutely right, Nikos, that I've changed a bit, and I was very hostile to human rights, but I'm a supporter of the Human Rights Act. But it doesn't allow the judges to strike down laws. It allows them to declare them incompatible with human rights. And that's quite a clever idea. The judges enter the political system and say, hey, if you do that, it's a breach of human rights. But people can continue to do it. But it alerts them. It seems to me there's something in that. Foreseeability. Well, you know, it is one of the main things you can take a case to the European Court of Human Rights on. There's a very, I was going to say entertaining, but it's an inappropriate word. Case where the English common law suddenly changed and men who were married were suddenly capable of being convicted of raping their wives. And two of these people took their case to Strasbourg and said, you know, we had no idea you could be done for rape. And the judges said you could because there was reasonably, it's one of the funniest lines in the European Court of Human Rights, it was reasonably foreseeable with independent legal advice that the law would change in this way. So you can imagine a trainee solicitor, first day in the office, a person knocks on the door and wants legal advice. They're planning to have sexual intercourse without consent with their wife, and they're wondering whether or not there's a risk of rape. But anyway, so check your foreseeability test. It's quite a good one in the European Convention on Human Rights. Kevin, I think the economic and social rights have become really valuable as a legal set of norms presently in order to focus the mind about the need to put individuals and the impact of policies on individuals at the core of policy making. The experts on this then tell you, of course, that none of them are extreme, that there are all these savings for practicability and so on, and that the critics who lampoon them as idiotically market-insensitive claims by deadbeats are wrong. And so I think, I did a book with Virginia, a great Greek scholar working in London on debating social rights on this. I think on balance, it's a really good addition to our discussion about economics that we have to think about rights. That doesn't mean that I think judges should be running the economic system. And that's where the debate is in the book I did with Virginia Montefiore.
May I ask you before...
and then I have only one remark about judges and change, and then...
Especially on that. I noted a phrase in your book, in your debate with Virginia. Virginia was in favor of legalizing, let's say, social rights, while Conor was, in fact, insisting more on political action. So I'm just reading a phrase, and I was wondering whether you would endorse it even today. Caring may indeed be part of our nature, but it is through politics rather than the law that we can embed this instinct in our culture and make what is second nature to some of us an assumption about right behavior that no one thinks to question. So it's rather through politics. My approach is through both.
And maybe, both. I could now try and sell our book, Costas, by saying I wrote a whole chapter in our book about instinct and what it means, and social anthropology, and how rights can be a way of appealing to our better instincts. But I think it's a fair point. But remember, that book I was supposed to fight with Virginia, so there was a reason for it.
Yes, we are supposed to.
We were supposed.
Sorry.
And my last one was just reacting to the serious point you made in that wonderful set of comments on my talk, Nikos, about judges.
Yes.
I was extremely critical of British judges in my youth, extremely. And it was all because of the way in which they had dealt with Irish cases so horribly. They were all these awful old men who'd been totally arrogant in their abuse of power. And lots of innocent working class Irish people were in jail for years and years because they were fitted up by corrupt organisations in the police and forensics. And this was overseen by judges, quite explicitly in the case of Lord Denning. And I had a lot of anger about them. Now, recently there's been a cultural change, generational change, that certainly added social value in Britain in the last 20 years. But I believe there's a reaction again. And a new crowd who formed their political identities during the Thatcher period are now coming into the senior levels of judiciary. Still only one woman, appointed in 2004, still the only one, Brenda Hale, the estimable Baroness Hale of Richmond, to whom we're giving an honorary degree next week, I'm glad to say. And with judges, the jury for me is always out. And I think, to end on John Finnis, whom they won't have read, but of course whom I've read, I think that world's coming back. These men who think that litigation is about two affluent litigants, never discussing resources, who are fed up with all these politically correct interventions by these trendies, barely women practically under the surface. And I think that could come back, and we need to be constantly mindful. Supreme Court Judge Lord Sumption gave an interview in The Standard the other day, a couple of months ago, saying, oh, women will never make it at the bar because, oh, we have to work so hard, we kings in the jungle. That remark was actually made, now disowned by the Supreme Court, etc., but still, it's capable of being made in public by a Supreme Court judge. An Eton boy promoted straight to the Supreme Court, a millionaire who argued for greater inequality in the 1970s as an advisor to Keith Joseph. So maybe this world of reactionary judges awaits me around the corner, completely different in the continent, I agree with you. Completely. Absolutely spot on there.
Would you like to respond?
Yes, if I may. Let me first apologize for using the term parochialism. Perhaps, very probably, it's an error. But I don't know why I got that impression, perhaps influenced by the fact that perhaps the majority of your colleagues in Britain seem to express this kind of approach. Sorry again. So, about the rule of law and its difference from the Rechtsstaat, I would say that you're right in pointing that the terms are not similar. I would say that, as strange as that would appear, that the rule of law in Britain is based more than on remedies and efficient remedies than in Europe, where it is based on substantial provisions of the law. So it is, the strange thing is that the British seem to have endorsed the Roman law approach of efficient remedies rather than abstract notions. So this is one of the ironies of history. The judges, might I remind you something that most of us tend to forget. As you very well know, the head of continental European positivism, I would say the mentor of generations of lawyers, was an Austrian constitutional scholar, Hans Kelsen. He has written a book and he has invented the idea of a constitutional court which would be specialized in adjudicating constitutional cases. He wrote his famous article and then his book in the interwar years, and he was a liberal, in fact, but he made a full separation between, I would say, law and social realities. Two things should be separated and so forth. He was very, very keen, though, in not proposing, in saying that the Bill of Rights should not be included in the Constitution, because if you include it, judges will become politicized. So that was an invention of the Americans on the aftermath of World War II. It was not Kelsen's idea to include the Bill of Rights into the Constitution. The Americans thought about it, you know, after the Nazi experience, the fascist experience, and so forth, put it in the Constitution and allow constitutional courts to enforce them. So he was right. Through the Bill of Rights into the Constitution, judges become politicized. That was the case in Europe after the Second World War, and that was the case also in the United States much earlier. So the United States, as you know much better than me, I'm sorry, as you know much better than me, I'm sure, starting from the interwar years when they played a very conservative role, and reaching the Warren Court, where they played a very progressive role and so forth, judges were doing politics. So my feeling is that your point of view that they should restrict themselves in strictly interpreting and applying existing rules and not in a creative interpretation which would fill the gaps. Sometimes I have the feeling that in Europe, in continental Europe, as was the case in America, when the political system was completely blocked, the judges found the solutions. I would say segregation in southern states in the United States in the 50s and 60s. The political system wouldn't vote for desegregation, and it was the Warren Court who did it, Brown and so forth. So might I ask you, don't you share this approach that judges sometimes, from a utilitarian point of view, might be very useful because they decide, they take decisions which are not taken by politicians because of obvious electoral reasons?
Can I just deal with that very, very briefly? My problem with that is I will take my wins and I'll have to take the defeats, and I have to calculate which is more likely. So it's a pragmatic judgment by me about whether I'll gain more by giving the judges that power than I will lose. Now, take the United States. Brown and the Board of Education, famous case, all it did was overturn a previous Supreme Court case called Plessy and Ferguson, which had sanctified separate but equal, and which had done so to set at naught constitutional amendments which had followed the Civil War. And there's shocking examples from America, post-Civil War Reconstruction legislation destroyed by a Southern majority bench fighting the Civil War again. The Civil War judges then were passed over, and Franklin Roosevelt had judges determined to destroy him. And they tried to destroy the New Deal. And so they turned post-1945, when Franklin Roosevelt put manners on them by threatening to put a whole lot of new people in there, they turned to civil and political rights, and now they've turned back. The overall story in America is not a good one, and I'm not sure there are many places where the overall story is a good one. It's interesting what the European Court of Justice is doing. It's behaving now a bit like the United States Supreme Court, filling in gaps, driving the agenda of Europe. Maybe there the gains outweigh the losses. I am a pragmatist about it. I'm a pragmatist. But I don't want to give them the power and then have to take the defeats which I think might exceed the victories, using those terms in a way that reveals I have a political perspective.
Thank you. We have time perhaps just for one last round of questions. Could we have the microphone at the front for Effie Forecast, please?
And the lady as well.
Please.
Hello, I'm Effie Foka, and I'd like to follow up on Marilena Simiti's question, if I may. Professor Gearty, you are probably speaking to a fairly secular audience, and I'm honestly not sure to what extent that's connected to my second point, which is that I suspect many in this audience, when you got to your second virus challenging Europe, the fear of religious extremism, they wondered why the fear of was in the title, and why not just the religious extremism as a challenge. And personally, I'm very much in favor of, I'm very sympathetic to the keeping of the fear of part of the story. But I wonder if you could speak to the whole concept of this violent religious extremism itself as a challenge to Europe, because of exactly what Marilena suggested, this, not Islamophobia only, but a negative attitude towards Islam in general that has been growing in Europe, and that in turn pressing on politicians in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question. Thank you. Here.
Χριστοφιλοπούλου. Η ερώτησή μου θα γίνει ελληνικά, παρακαλώ, μετά θα είναι με σύντομη, μεταφράστε στους κυρίους. Ο κύριος καθηγητής αναφέρθηκε στην αδυναμία της πολιτικής να ελέγξει τις αγορές, να ελέγξει το κεφάλαιο. Τον κίνδυνο το κεφάλαιο να ελέγχει την πολιτική δεν θα έπρεπε να τον επισημάνουμε? Δεν το βλέπετε από ευρωπαϊκή σκοπιά? Στις χώρες βλέπουμε να συμβαίνει. Ευχαριστώ.
Thank you. I think there was another question. Yeah, could we take the question in the center, please?
Dimitris Katsoudas. I would like to pose the issue of allegiance. Why is it that legality at the European level, as well as at the national level, and the attitude of citizens towards institutions is in some ways waning? In a speech of mine last year, I introduced the issue of the loss of double allegiance. Theoretically, the existence of a supranational level of the European Union, and of course the existing framework of the nation state, would ideally give you a hopeful prospect of resorting to a dual allegiance, which is a further guarantee of your rights and your possibilities. But what we have seen in recent years, particularly with the weakness of Europe vis-à-vis the external world and its immediate regions, but mainly because of its inefficiency in dealing with its internal crisis, is the collapse of this allegiance. People, take Greece, take the southern states, which had suffered from what happened in recent years. People have lost their faith in their own nation state. And at the same time, they have lost their faith in the supranational organization to which they belong. And I think this creates an erosive situation for democratic rights, because people do not believe that they can resort or that they can find answers.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm afraid you do, but we'll take two questions. There's one in the center. There was someone in the center with it? Yes. Yes. Could we take the question? Excuse me, could we take the question in the center? We're not taking the question in the center. We're going to the gentleman without the aid of the microphone.
At one point, you mentioned there's a doubt of the legality of the European Union system. Why isn't anybody doing something about it, challenging those doubts in the courts?
Thank you. That's wonderfully precise. There's a question in the center. The lady in the center, please. This will have to be the final question.
Hello. My name is Vasiliki Zigura. I'm a former LSE student, and I'm glad to be here tonight to hear this interesting lecture by Professor Gearty. And I think it's quite an irony that you talk about human rights in Greece at this time, this moment. And I would like to ask you, I mean, you spoke of an ideal Europe, a healthy European Union. And suddenly, 3 viruses that somehow were there, they erupted and they contaminate the whole body. I mean, I would like to ask you, do you see any problems in the structure of the European Union that might have led to the situation that we face today? And I mean, this containment of the market power, for example, I mean, how can you do this? The European Union started mainly as an economic project and facilitated economic exchange. And one of the values, of the 4 basic values, principles, is the free movement of goods. So how can you, I don't know, compromise this? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Who wants to go first? Conor, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Kevin. Yeah, I'll go through them in the order in which they came, if I may, and I'll be short, because I think it was focal. It was really, I spent a lot of time thinking about what to call it, and it absolutely is fear of religious extremism, not religious extremism, because that plays into the hands of those who say there is this terrible thing we now divide. It's our perception of it. And I am absolutely with Rowan Williams, who made a brilliant speech about, he was the then Archbishop of Canterbury, got in a huge amount of trouble with it. We need to give religion its space, subject to a basic human rights floor, because religion is an important part of the identity of many, many people. And secular people have difficulty in understanding the degree of importance that the religious has for people as part of themselves. And because they don't quite understand it, I'm not saying this about you for a moment, they don't understand it, they're unsympathetic to it. But there has to be a human rights floor. You can't just marry 6 people because your culture says you can have those 6 people as your wives. But it is fear of religious extremism for that reason. On the second question, thank you very much. I'm glad the interpretation went so well. Certainly it was very accurate for me. I think law does facilitate markets, and politics can control law. And the markets are not out with politics. The success of an ideology is that we think it's out with our capacity to control it. And it's really important that we see that we have control of our own destiny, that we don't have to accept that things are uncontrollable when we have control over our destiny. Some things are more difficult to control, but they are controllable. On Demetrius's point about loss of double allegiance, acute and fascinating, and reminds me of the United States, because the breakthrough for the United States, somehow or other, we might think about analogies with the European Union, was when they saw that you could be a citizen of 2 places, not 1. You had all these places, the 13 founding states, and then you had the United States of America. And the brilliant insight that you didn't have to worry about were you a citizen of North Carolina or a citizen of Massachusetts or a citizen of the United States. You could be both and. In Europe, both and worked for a while, but actually the nation state itself hasn't delivered that level of allegiance. So we need to think about treble allegiance. I'm a proud Catalan, a proud Spaniard, and a proud European. I'm a proud Ulster man or woman, a proud British person, and a proud European. We are some way from having that as a kind of authentic remark. How did the Americans do it? Well, they had a rather large civil war. The United Kingdom of today is the North Carolina, if it was North Carolina then. Mr. Calhoun, no relation so far as I know of my boss, the secession, we'd rather like, they said, to end this union. It's been tremendously good knowing you, we're off. And the union said, I'm sorry, you can't go. And they had a civil war. And nothing actually, I don't need to be Hegelian to say, nothing focuses the mind and helps with identity than the biggest war that has ever happened. And I'm not sure we want that as a price of our bonding with each other. We also need to remember that whenever America got a bit tense, it could buy the equivalent of Western Europe. And so once it got rid of all the local people through what we would now call genocide, it had quite a lot of space to grow into and became unparalleledly prosperous. So double allegiance worked there. Treble allegiance here is much more complicated, but worth fighting for. The question about what happens in law, well, it does work itself through the legal system eventually. Cases are heard. The Pringle case is an example. Coddy and others like it are good cases on control of the terrorism laws that have come through. So there are pieces of important litigation happening from time to time. Most recently and damagingly from the British political perspective, the prisoners' rights to vote case. So it does happen, just not as quickly as you might like, I think. Facilious former LSE structures, I think that was the last one. I think the article in there has a lot about the Constitution. I think that may have been a misjudgment to push ahead for the European Constitution at a time when it might have been achievable, nobody thought it was needed. At a time when it was thought to be needed, it wasn't achievable. And I think more energy devoted to clearer analysis of structural defects, which could then be repaired in a less grand way, might have been a better use of energy at that time. We published in the Modern Law Review an article by Mark Lawson and Florence DeWitt about the instability of the European framework 4 or 5 years ago, and I edited it. It was terrifying, really, how poorly constructed the European framework was. And we're paying a price for grandiosity which failed instead of careful, pragmatic reworking which might have succeeded.
Thank you. Just a word.
Please.
I wonder whether you share, Conor, the view that, in fact, Europe has gone through 2 civil wars, the 2 world wars.
Yeah.
So we hope that she will grow the conclusions and go on. My feeling, though, in creating, let's say, what I would say a European patriotism, which is absolutely needed, is being proud for going back to the essentials and being proud for them. I was reading in yesterday's Le Monde an article by a friend colleague urging François Hollande not to constitutionalize l'état d'urgence, which is perhaps one of the issues after the last dramatic events. We need to resist on that. We need to give the fight, but let us not take for granted even the essentials. Even the right to vote, even the right to freedom of expressions and so forth, are, we live in a paradise. And I don't really share your view that it is an irony to talk about human rights in Greece. I don't agree with you. There are undeniably cases in which human rights, especially social rights, are violated to a great extent. But you shouldn't ignore the fact that Greece is a democratic country where the rule of law exists. There are undeniably some mad fool people, taking legal action. There are cases all over the country which are ridiculous. Might I remind you that that a court case started yesterday in Crete, where Heinz Richter is being accused, after receiving his doctorate honoris causa decree from the University of Crete, was accused for racism because he used an expression in a book, on Crete, on the people of Crete, which was considered as, insulting and so forth. In a book, a German scholar who is a lover of Greece, as you may imagine. You cannot, in my opinion, draw conclusions from the fact, from these kind of anecdotic events. Greece remains a free country. Europe remains a free country. We should fight to keep it and to go on with the new challenges. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, this has been a lecture in this series, as I say, with the Megaron Plus and the Alumni Association and the Hellenic Observatory. I'm sure this evening's lecture has been of great interest. Please do look at our future events, which will be on the Megaron sites, or indeed on the sites of the Hellenic Observatory at the LSE. It simply leaves me to invite you to join me in thanking my colleague Conor Gearty and our guest discussant Nikos Allivizatos for a very interesting discussion indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you.